Let's start session 3A. This is considerations for 100% zero marginal cost markets. And I would like to introduce Dr. Robin Hytowitz of NextEra Energy. She's the energy management analyst at energy management advisor at NextEra. She is also the task force chair of our markets for 100% clean energy. So Robin.
Thanks, Debbie. I got my title wrong when I told her the first time, so we can excuse that. So welcome to the session. I will do a slight course corrections. It says considerations for zero marginal cost markets, but our task force is 0% clean energy markets. And so we're going to make that, I think most of the panelists can definitely speak to zero marginal cost, but really we're looking at clean energy, which we usually expand to hydrogen, batteries, demand response. So we're pretty open arms when it comes to different resource types. So this panel is based on a task force, an ESIG task force, as I just mentioned, which came out of a great workshop that happened last year that Eric Ehler ran. And in that task force, they really were focused on this question of what are the future visions and what are our options for 100% clean energy market. Does it look like our markets do today? Do we need significant changes? Are we starting over, or is it really just small modifications? And so in that workshop, and something that we've kind of put into the task force is different categories. So we can look at price formation, transmission, demand participation, clean energy goals, RA, essential reliability services. So it really, we cover a really broad swath of area within electricity markets, within the energy industry. And so all of those things are kind of on the table for our discussion, and then for, of course, questions from after. And so please look forward and look to a paper coming at the end of the year from our task force. And with that, I'm going to hand it over. So our first speaker, let me get your title right, is Chris Geissler, the Director of Economic Analysis at ISO New England.
Can folks hear me? All right. Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Chris Geissler. I work at ISO New England, and today I'm just going to talk a little bit about what's sort of going on in ISO New England, kind of with a focus on two specific areas. So the first, when I think about decarbonization, I think about sort of two questions as really being critical as we think about how we move towards the, whether it's a zero marginal cost or perhaps, more accurately, sort of a zero emission grid of the future. So the first is sort of how can we efficiently facilitate this transition? I tend to think about this in the context of public policy, whether it's environmental markets, other things to help facilitate the grid's move towards low and zero emitting resources. And then the second is sort of if and when we get there, sort of how do we set up our wholesale markets in order to ensure that we can continue to operate the system reliably with this new set of resources and some of the challenges that may present. So I'll go through sort of each of these questions, probably spending a little more time on the first one because we've done a bunch of work in that space over the last couple of years. And then if time allows, I'll also spend a little bit of time giving an overview of sort of the second, with more of an eye towards the future as to where we see things headed. So first, I'll just give kind of an overview of sort of how things work today. So the New England states have ambitious decarbonization goals, ranging from 70 or 80% decarbonization targets all the way to 100%. And some of these are more stringent in how they're codified in state policy, but I think there's kind of a clear recognition from the region, from ISO, from market participants that the grid of the future is going to be highly decarbonized in order to align with these public policy objectives. Some of these objectives, also are not just about pure, reductions in carbon emissions, but have other sort of policy aims as well, maybe related to certain types of technologies. In New England, for example, offshore wind is a topic in an area that has garnered a lot of attention over the last 5 or 10 years. And so currently the way that the states are seeking to meet their objectives is to largely sign agreements with large new developers of new non-emitting projects. So offshore wind plants, other types of non-emitting generation. And so these are done through sort of a series of negotiations, bilateral deals, and what will happen is the states and the developer will agree on some terms. Often it'll involve a sort of a fixed price for the energy that the project can provide, and then that fixed price is sort of passed through to consumers through sort of a charge in the bills. At the same time, so this doesn't really interact that directly with our markets, but of course it does have effects on the markets. And so one thing we've seen is, especially as there have been challenges with respect to siting, supply chains, changes in interest rates, et cetera. Some of these contracts are being renegotiated, or the timing that was originally expected is being pushed out just because it's taking longer to complete projects than expected, I should say. And then one other factor that we see here is these contracts, because the resources don't, they're going to get paid a fixed price for the energy they provide. They don't necessarily have strong incentives to sort of offer into our markets at their marginal costs. And so one thing we haven't necessarily seen it sort of yet, because the number of resources that are sort of under this regime today is relatively modest. But going forward, as more and more resources potentially are sort of operating with a power purchase agreement in hand, we may see higher frequency of negative energy prices from resources signing these contracts. And there's a bunch of sort of snowball effects from that happy to get into a little bit more in the Q&A if folks are interested. So that's sort of where we are today. And I think from that, there's a realization that this is an approach that has worked I think reasonably well to date, but may not scale when we're going from having a relatively small number of resources sort of operating within this framework to potentially a majority of the resources, and in some cases all the resources providing energy might be on power purchase agreements. So it raises some questions. Are there other ways we can or should do this in order to potentially get similarly meet the decarbonization objectives of the region, but do so in a way that's maybe more efficient? And there's one last thing. So the New England states do have a number of other environmental policies that are in place today. So these include all 6 states are members of RGGI, which is a cap and trade program that's a number of states in the sort of the East and Northeast participate in. And then also they have renewable portfolio standards with different classes of RECs. So these are all sort of there as well, and can be thought of as sort of market or market-like mechanisms, but they don't tend to provide enough revenue on their own to facilitate the entry of new clean resources, at least to the degree necessary to meet the state's environmental objectives. So kind of from that, there's been a number of discussions that the region has had. The ISO has been a part of, but by no means sort of, it hasn't been the ISO sort of driving as much as having discussions with the states and with the regional stakeholders about are there other policies or ways in which we could design or think about environmental markets or mechanisms in order to decarbonize in a similar way, but perhaps more efficiently. And so 2 that we've discussed at length that I'll touch on here are net carbon pricing and forward clean energy market, or FCEM. And so I'll discuss each of these in a little bit more detail. So first, net carbon pricing effectively assigns a price to each ton of carbon that is emitted, and that price is then sort of incurred by the generator that is emitting the carbon. As one might expect, they will reflect that price in how they offer into the energy market. And so it creates sort of potential incentives to, if I can do things to my plant to reduce how much carbon I emit or not emit at all, that gives me an advantage over my competitor that emits more carbon. And so it's sort of a market mechanism that creates incentives. And that money that is collected associated with the emissions can then be used for any number of things. It can be sort of rebated back to end users. It can be used for other environmental programs and policies, et cetera. And so this can be done either with sort of a fixed price that's set, ahead of time, or via a cap and trade program where we say, here's how much carbon we would allow the region or expect the region to emit, and there's sort of permits associated with that. And to emit carbon, you have to essentially buy or have a permit for each ton of carbon that you emit. So there's different ways depending on if you want to have more sort of certainty about the price or the quantity. And there's a lot of ways to adjust that as well. Unlike the current regime, that tends to increase energy prices because instead of having resources offer, say, negatively, we actually have resources that emit carbon increasing their offers. But as I said before, those higher energy prices are not just sort of a pass through. There is sort of an opportunity to either rebate load or to use that revenue in other ways. And so this is a policy that there's a lot of sort of academic literature on. It's I think economists and tend to really like it because it sort of very cleanly and sort of efficiently prices the attribute that we're trying to eliminate or reduce in a transparent way. However, there is a number of ways in which there have been concerns we've heard, some of which are sort of just the fact of potentially increasing costs in some cases through higher energy prices, and sort of the notion that this could be thought of as a tax is one that certainly makes some folks nervous. And then additionally, it requires a high degree of coordination because you need to have essentially in New England, the 6 states agree to what either the price or the cap is. And if different folks have very different expectations, it can create cases where folks feel like, the policies of another, or the sort of ambitions of another state are sort of being passed through in higher costs to the consumers in my state. So forward clean energy market. So this is a different idea, and one that really kind of came about from a number of discussions with stakeholders and got a lot of interest from stakeholders in the States. This is, I tend to think of it at a conceptual level, like a very sort of centralized forward market for renewable energy certificates, but perhaps with a broader sort of criteria for eligibility. So in New England, for example, nuclear units are not eligible to receive RECs, whereas in a forward clean energy market, if the goal is really about decarbonization, then one could think of nuclear units as being eligible to receive these certificates like other resources that don't emit carbon. And one thing that I think was a real interest or focal point for stakeholders was allowing this not just to happen sort of during the year in which we're focused on, but actually have a forward component. So buyers and sellers can kind of agree to transact, some period forward, say 3 years, and that could provide revenues to developers who are looking to sort of get financing and sort of have projects in place and provide some certainty, so that sort of helped move those projects along. And then the states could get some certainty about, achieving various clean energy targets. And so the forward element then does require this piece of, if I sell something forward and I don't actually deliver on it, there needs to be some sort of mechanism or true up that occurs during the delivery period. So in this framework, there would also be the opportunity, or if you sold a bunch of, say, clean energy certificates forward, and then the power plant didn't actually produce those clean energy certificates because it wasn't, maybe it didn't come online at the time in forecast, or the weather was very different, they would then have to buy essentially buy the additional credits from the secondary market. And so there's sort of a mechanism in place to help prevent or facilitate that people aren't sort of making or buying or selling things that then they don't deliver upon. And so this is sort of the type of discussion that we've had with stakeholders, and I think there's a fair amount of interest in considering something like this as well. And so I think one thing we found is this also can produce negative energy prices, which is a sort of an interesting phenomenon, because if I'm a clean energy resource, I account for the value of a clean energy certificate when I submit an offer. So you can think about that like, say, a production tax credit or REC or something. And so much like with the status quo, we saw as we sort of ramp up, we may get more and more, kind of prices become increasingly negative as the prices associated with these certificates gets more positive. Additionally, it doesn't meet the objectives quite as, or at least a decarbonization objective, quite as efficiently as a carbon price, because there's some sort of nuance that it doesn't capture, like, for example, trading off between two different resources that emit carbon, but one emits less carbon, say a very efficient combined cycle versus a peaker or a coal plant or something that has a higher sort of emissions rate. In a clean energy certificate framework, that difference is not really captured in any way because neither of them is eligible for a clean energy certificate. Whereas in a carbon price, the resource that emits more carbon actually pays a higher sort of adder from the carbon price because of the price it pays is proportional to the amount of carbon it emits. One feature that is, I think, attractive about this is while it does require a degree of regional coordination, it doesn't require nearly as much because each state or sort of area can set their own sort of targets as to how many clean energy certificates they want to procure on behalf of their consumers. And so they don't have to reach sort of a consensus as to a single price or quantity for the whole region. And so the concerns about one area, say, subsidizing the environmental policy of another is less pronounced. However, there is an importance of sort of agreeing on what the products are, where as you get into more and more, you introduce more and more products because of technology, location, et cetera, it starts to, the efficiencies of having a centralized forward market start to sort of decrease, and instead it's maybe has the feel or the look of a market, but if you're really targeting very specific types of resources and locations, it actually feels a lot more in practice like the current rules where it's really a procurement or a specific sort of agreement with a developer for a specific project. So then I just wanted to talk a little bit about, we kind of studied these conceptually, but we also worked closely with colleagues at the analysis group to try to sort of quantify some of these impacts or how how they may perform relative to each other. So we looked at scenarios where the region decarbonized 80% relative to 1990 levels. And this study is publicly available at the ISO's website as well. So I encourage folks who are interested to look further, but just wanted to highlight a couple of, I think, interesting observations. So one, decarbonization is going to be very expensive. I think we wanted to understand that, and at least in a world where we assume sort of the current set of technologies are available. I mean, we did allow for sort of costs to sort of trend downward for new technologies, but this study didn't have, for example, the development of clean hydrogen or other sort of other types of technologies like that, which could affect the results. But it is quite expensive relative to kind of what we cost today on a per megawatt hour basis. We found net carbon pricing was the most effective or most efficient, I should say, although the FCEM actually performed very similarly. Although I do think that maybe that result may not sort of generalize quite as much to other regions that have a number of different sort of emitting technologies, whereas in New England, it's really almost exclusively natural gas. And I think that feature probably meant that the relative increase in cost for the FCEM compared to net carbon pricing was more modest than it may be elsewhere. Additionally, the status quo we found was more expensive by about 9%, which is a significant number. And then we did find about half the time by 2040, we're seeing negative prices under either the status quo or the FCEM. So can raises questions about sort of the energy market and sort of its role in looking ahead in a world where these are the environmental policies that we have in place. So then I just wanted to spend a couple minutes, and I realize I'm short on time, so I'm going to try to do this very quickly, just talking about sort of not just the environmental policy landscape, but sort of what are we thinking about in terms of the market space, knowing that this is coming. And so creates a lot of new sources of uncertainty. You can think about weather and affecting both the supply and in New England the demand side, and creating a lot more sort of uncertainty as to how much generation we're going to need and from who, over various operational timeframes. So both day to day, hour to hour, and also sort of in a longer time horizon. And so we have a number of projects that are sort of in different phases. So one is capacity accreditation, where we are looking at changing our capacity framework so that instead of just accrediting resources based on some sort of nameplate with some adjustments for certain types of resources, it's really based on expected performance during the periods when the resources are most needed. And in the past, we tended to think of that as the summer peak, but going forward, we realize that it's a much sort of richer set of conditions under which reliability concerns may arise, including the winter in New England, extended cold spells, and then also periods when perhaps the weather, the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing for a period of time, and how we manage that if wind and solar are a much bigger portion of our generation going forward. So that's something that we are actively or are discussing with stakeholders. We've been talking about for the last couple of years, and actually are just kicking off sort of a new set of discussions with stakeholders on that in the coming months. And then finally, we also are thinking not just about the long-term planning horizon, but also the shorter-term operational horizon, and the fact that kind of unexpected weather, even in a minute-by-minute basis, may affect how much generation we need and who we're committing over very short-term intervals, to account for the fact that cloud cover could really affect the solar generation over a short-term time horizon, and we need to have other generation available to meet those sort of peaks and valleys, so to speak. And so we're working through and sort of thinking about flexible response services and sort of a new framework to think about the procurement of ancillary services in the day ahead in real-time markets that's responsive to sort of market condition or system conditions generally, and sort of accounts for weather and uncertainty associated with weather. So I know there's going to be a bunch of discussions this afternoon about some of the modeling that goes into that space, but that's sort of just gives an overview of maybe where we're thinking about, and more to come on that. So I think I am now just at time, so I will pause, and happy to give it back to you, Robin. Oh yeah, I should just apologize.
Thanks so much, Chris. We'll take questions at the end, like the other sessions. Now I am happy to, let's get you teed up. Happy to introduce Arne Olson, who is the senior partner at Energy and Environmental Economics. Take it away.
Okay. A lot of what I talk about today is summarized in the paper that we wrote a couple of years ago called Scalable Markets for the Energy Transition, a Blueprint for Wholesale Reform. A lot of the themes are very similar to you heard Chris talk about. So, we know that there are lots of changes happening on our grid, and there are lots of proposals for how we reinvent or rethink our market institutions in response to these changes. We think it's important before you go about designing solutions to really understand what the nature of the problem is. We think of this in the form of externalities. What externalities might there be that our current markets aren't addressing? We think these fall largely into three categories, and these shape the solutions that I'm going to propose. One is that there may not be enough signals for operational flexibility to address all the variability that we expect in forecast error from wind and solar. Number two is there is a big issue with investment, a signal for resources to ensure resource adequacy. And then the third is a price signal to reflect the societal value of carbon emission reductions or clean energy. And our solutions kind of, again, largely fall along those lines. There have been a variety of ideas posed for how to reinvent our market institutions. The centralized forward clean energy procurement, the FCEM idea that you heard Chris talk about, is an interesting one. There's folks that want to go farther and do centralized multi-attribute procurement. It's clean energy and capacity and maybe even flexibility all at the same time. There are proposals for mandatory forward energy procurement to help solve the resource adequacy issue, ISO run carbon pricing, and now this new one of temporally matched clean energy procurement. Lots and lots of interesting ideas. Again, we need to kind of sort through what the real problems are to address which of these solutions or what set of them meets our needs. So I like to summarize this in a couple of just high-level observations. One is that the physical needs of our grid is going to mostly remain the same. It's mostly just based on the needs of the loads. We're trying to, work all the resources and the loads to make sure that all the loads get met. What's going to change is that the physical capabilities of the resources that provide those services, that's going to change a lot, and our market institutions need to evolve to address that. The clean attribute of clean energy, this is really a societal value and a societal need, not a grid need. The grid doesn't need clean energy, it just needs energy. And that has some implications for how we design our clean energy markets, which we'll get into. And then largely, we think our existing wholesale markets have been very, very important at helping to get the levels of clean energy penetration that we've seen so far. It's been really important to get that level of scale, the market access, the efficient operations. So we should be really careful that we don't sort of throw the baby out with the bathwater when we're thinking about redesigning these markets. And that largely leads to the theme that permeates throughout the presentation, which is that you'll hear me talk about reforms that are focused on refinement and reinvigoration rather than reinvention of our market institutions. We think that our market institutions are well placed to get us to our end goal with some continued tweaks. And we've always been tweaking them. For the last 25 years, we've continued to tweak them as technology and other processes have evolved. And there's some tweaks that we need from here on out. And so I'm going to talk about them in three categories. The first, as I talked about, is energy and grid services market reforms. There's a whole bunch of detail here. I'm going to probably go through this relatively quickly. But the first is we need to more dynamically think about what our operating reserves are. And so you heard Chris talk about this already. We have needs that are dynamic based on grid conditions. Solar and wind are most variable at the middle range of their production. You don't need too much reserve at night in case solar goes lower. It's not going to go any lower than zero. And similarly, if it's already at its maximum, it's not going to go any higher. So you don't need to carry downward or upward reserves in case it goes, or downward reserves in case it goes higher. So we need to think about our flexible operating reserves as being dynamic with grid conditions and really establish dynamic requirements that are settled through the market for things like flexible ramping services or regulation services that are the services that are there to make sure that we have the resources we need to address sort of normal everyday fluctuations. These inverter-based resources are really, really flexible. They can go from 100 to 0 in just a few seconds and back up to whatever the weather allows. We need to get them into the market, dispatching and potentially even providing some of these ancillary services. On the right, top right there is just a graphic that shows the response accuracy of wind and solar in the green and the yellow as compared to conventional resources. Wind and solar is in the 90% accurate range. The most flexible, the most accurate conventional resources are in the 50 to 60% range. So these resources can be the solution to the flexibility problems that they create if we create the market institutions that allows them to do that as and when it's cost effective to do so. One of the reforms that helps us do this is to separate our flexible reserve products and regulation products into upward and downward products. Geissler already has this. I think some of the markets are moving in this direction, are looking to. For conventional resources, it's probably not that important. The heat rate curves do vary a little bit depending on whether you're going up or down from your current set point, but that's not a big issue. But it is a big issue for both wind and solar resources and battery storage resources. So wind and solar can go from, again, from wherever they're at to 0 in a few seconds. And they don't mind providing a reserve service to do that as long as they don't expect to be called upon very much. But in order for them to provide an upward reserve service, they have to maintain headroom on their resource, purposely forego energy production that has both an energy and a REC value. That's going to be very expensive for them to do that. So they have asymmetric opportunity cost curves with respect to their ability to provide ancillary services. And the same is true for energy storage. So if I'm a battery resource and I expect prices to go up, I'm probably going to be charging, and I'm going to be pretty reluctant to stop charging because that diminishes my ability to take advantage of the arbitrage opportunities that I expect to see in the market. And so I have an opportunity cost price that's based on those future opportunities. If I'm charging at max, might not even be able to go down. I can't start charging anymore. So both my ability and my opportunity cost for charging is gonna vary in the upward and downward direction. Because we expect batteries to provide a large proportion of these services going forward, it's going to be really, really important to provide them with price signals that allows them to optimize their own operations with respect to grid values. And then lastly, and this is more of a longer term dream probably, is to fully optimize battery resources over their dispatch duration. This is probably computationally not tractable in today's markets, but we should think of this as a long-term goal. And in the meantime, we need to make sure that in order for the combination of battery operations and grid operations to get there, is to ensure that we incorporate opportunity costs concepts into bid pricing for battery resources, and also automated bid mitigation. Because whatever, if my duration goes longer than the market optimization, then I've got this asymmetric opportunity cost that needs to be reflected in whether the grid uses me now or uses me later. With respect to forward capacity market reforms, I know I'm not covering a lot of ground and not doing any of this probably really justice, so feel free to find me afterwards, but this is, you can also read about it in the report. I mean, Chris talked about this also, is the reform that's needed is to make sure that our forward capacity constructs are focusing on the critical reliability periods. So we need to both determine need, allocate need, and accredit resources based on their impact during these critical periods. This is a graphic from California's grid on September the 6th of 2022. We had a near miss, very, very close. We only survived because Governor Newsom sent out the Amber Alert, which told everyone to turn off everything that was unnecessary. We got about 2 gigawatts of response from that instantly. Very, very close near miss. But the problem, the hour that was the most constrained was hour ending 7 p.m. right after the sun went down. You can see a few hours earlier, we had much higher loads. We weren't challenged then with reliability. It was after the sun went down. So in the old days, it was the peak load that was directly coincident with our critical reliability periods. And it was a nice shortcut just to say, we're going to focus on peak load. Now we have to focus on the highest net peak load in effect. So load in combination with the potential for wind and solar not to be there when you want it to be. That's the theme. So just to give you a little bit of graphics on sort of, and conceptual thoughts on where we've been and where we're going to, is in the past, we mostly just were able to focus on peak load. And we also had resources that kind of all looked alike. They were mostly all firm and dispatchable. So it turns out we were living in a linear simplification of a more complex problem and didn't realize it. So in effect, we could just say, we'll credit every resource at its nameplate capacity. And we know that's not right. But we can just socialize the difference between their nameplate capacity and their effective capacity with a higher reserve margin. And it was kind of no harm, no foul. So at the bottom there, you can see the installed capacity for the system is the simple sum of the nameplate capacity of each individual generator on the system. We're moving to a world now where it's more complex than that. We have individual resources that have very large differences in their availability on peak. It would be absurd to accredit wind and solar based on their nameplate. There are significant interactions among the resources. They're no longer independent. So you can't just take a simple sum. It's now a complex function of how those resources perform with respect and to their interactions with each other throughout the entire time period. And we have ELCC values that are dynamic based on the resource mix. And so now we're not just adding up installed capacity anymore. We have to calculate what the total ELCC, effective load carrying capability, is that we get from our entire portfolio. It's a complex function of each of the individual generators on the system. And on the right-hand side there, we can't just add up the individual resource capacities anymore, because there's this little thing on top called portfolio effects, which is a function of all of the resources together and can't be allocated to any individual resource exclusively. The portfolio ELCC, you can think of as a multidimensional surface if you're a math person, which I am. I had to go through this before I fully knew that I understood what the nature of the problem. But this surface here is, in effect, the height of the surface is the amount of ELCC that you get from your entire portfolio. It's a function of multi-dimensions. You can think of each generator as a dimension, or maybe more simplistically, each generator class is a dimension, okay? Now, if we want to calculate the ELCC, or what any individual resource can contribute toward helping us meet our total need, that's really the change in the total with respect to a change in that individual resource. That's the definition of a partial derivative. So it's a partial derivative of this portfolio ELCC function with respect to a change in any one, in the quantity of any one resource type. So now this is a surface. The functional form of this surface is unknowable. All we can really do is kind of sample it using loss of load probability model runs to kind of get a sense for what the shape of this surface is. It's impractical to map out the entire surface, but that's okay, because we really only need to focus on where we are on that surface today and where we expect to go over the foreseeable future. So in other words, what portfolio do we have today, and how do we expect that portfolio to change over the time horizon of our investment decisions? That's the part of the surface that we need to focus on. But you can see the marginal ELCC is the critical value that tells us, if I make a change to the portfolio, how much more reliability service do I get? And so because these interactions aren't just confined to wind and solar, gas can help charge batteries as well, and does. During every reliability event that we expect to see over the next decade at least, the batteries are going to be charged with gas. There's not going to be excess wind and solar in such close proximity in time to when you really need the batteries to be discharging for reliability. So these interactions are not just wind and solar. And the correlated outages we know is a big issue with fuel combusting resources. That all needs to be factored into a marginal ELCC framework. So we need to recognize that no resource is perfect, that there are many interactive effects, and we need to create a level playing field where thermal resources, batteries, wind, et cetera, solar are all competing with each other based on their marginal ability to improve the reliability of the system. So this is kind of a simple whirlwind, I guess, tour of where all of the ISOs really are functionally moving towards. And if we go there, this will help us address all of the limitations that people have expressed about the existing capacity market constructs, which is not just forced outages, but it's energy availability, fuel availability, duration limitations or use limitations for various different types of resources, variability in hourly output, temperature, and seasonal derates. These are all factored in, if your model is good, to this marginal ELCC framework. And then I don't want this is an afterthought in this deck, but it shouldn't be. I just didn't know quite where to put it, is that we need to incorporate as much price responsive demand as we can to take as much pressure as we can off of these capacity constructs. The more that we can get scarcity pricing into the markets, the more that we can get loads that we know are going to be price responsive and get off the system if prices get bad enough. The less we'll have to do on a forward going basis. So this is also really, really important. And then finally talking through the clean energy, the third externality, which is the clean energy externality. So thinking about how we should create market institutions for this clean energy attribute, I want to stop and first think about what characteristics our clean energy markets should have. So first of all, we want them to be scalable. We're not going to really make a dent in the climate problem without getting to 70, 80, 90% clean energy over time. So that should be the goal of any of our clean energy market institutions, ultimately, is to scale that as rapidly and as far as you possibly can. We want them to be economically efficient, send the best price signals to achieve the least cost carbon emission reductions everywhere. They should be stable to provide a stable and predictable investment signal for the value of new clean energy resources. Our markets should be liquid so that we can transact in them with low transaction costs. We should be able to stand this up as rapidly as we can. That's urgency. And ideally, they should accurately measure and assign responsibility for carbon emissions. So just a word about kind of where we've been with clean energy markets and policy. So I wanted to highlight the bottom thing here. Carbon pricing has all of these characteristics. So if you just wave a magic wand and say we're going to do carbon pricing everywhere, then that would solve all of this, and that would be the end of the conversation. The challenge is politically, it's very hard to get there. And you also have to get there across the entire market. If you have carbon pricing on part of the market, it creates wrinkles that can lead to bad outcomes. So in lieu of that, we're focusing on the inverse. So the inverse of carbon pricing is in effect clean energy subsidization, or creating a market for clean energy through demand pull policies. Create a market for clean energy, and supply will follow. And in this market, the REC has kind of a very specific economic meaning. It's the clean energy missing money, the amount of subsidy that's needed to get clean energy into the market, which would not otherwise be economic, over and above what money they're able to make from energy grid services and capacity markets. Now, if you're someone who doesn't like RECs or are suspicious of RECs, and you think, if I'm just buying an unbundled REC, am I really buying clean energy? Well, I got news for you, okay? All specified energy purchases are a fiction. There is no world in which the energy that you're buying is actually serving your load physically. That generator is injecting power into the grid somewhere and displacing a set of resources, and you're withdrawing from the grid somewhere else, and other resources are ramping down in response to that. There is no physical power flow that connects those two things. There's only a contractual and a money flow, which is why this fiction is actually really, really important. Billions and billions of dollars are being invested based on this fiction. So we need to make sure that we understand it, and we all kind of agree on what this fiction is and what it means. The other bad news, if you hate RECs, thank you, is that RECs are needed to make all this work. The only way that you can be sure that you're getting clean energy is because of the REC. It has no other meaning, and there is no other way that you can know unless you're like behind the meter, off the grid somewhere. Otherwise, the REC is the thing that guarantees to you that you're buying clean energy. So it's also then useful for portfolio balancing, trading efficiency, et cetera. So what's wrong with all of that? Well, lots of things. First of all, today, our REC markets are highly fragmented and inefficient. They've been done in response to hundreds of different state and local policies with all kinds of different flavors and definitions and requirements and specifications. It's not liquid and not efficient from a national and global perspective, which is what we need it to be in order to address the climate challenge, for it to be scalable to address the climate challenge. So we have highly inconsistent net implied carbon prices from these. So like a New Jersey SREC or a DC solar REC has an implied carbon cost of $700 per ton, whereas a Texas wind REC might be $3 per ton of carbon reduction. If carbon is the goal, and it needs to be to achieve our climate objectives, then this is a very inefficient way to get there. So our proposal is to sort of build on the idea of this forward clean energy market and make it really into a national market. We need to reinvigorate our REC market. Rather than throwing it away, we need to breathe life into it and reinvigorate it and reestablish it at a national level so that this becomes a commoditized way for people everywhere, not just the high margin companies like Apple and Google, et cetera, to participate in this market, but any mom and pop store, anybody who wants to participate can go and get a REC that's at a low transaction cost and participate in this market. And it doesn't matter to us whether it's that these RECs are created through a centralized auction, that's kind of the middle part there, or whether they're long-term PPAs, and maybe they'll be both because people want to hedge what the auction results will be. Maybe they'll just be fully merchant resources, no long-term contract at all. They're all creating a commodity energy transition credit that you can trade at a national level. And ideally, you'd put this on one of the national commodity exchanges like the Chicago Board of Trade, because then you'd have a visible signal nationwide for the value of clean energy. It would become the Henry Hub of RECs, which Henry Hub, is a really, really valuable signal for the value of new natural gas. I want to then touch on, this wasn't our idea, but I like it. And so I'm going to highlight it here as well, this Emissions First Coalition idea. If you haven't seen this, it's the idea is to create a national commoditized certificate that's not based on the megawatt hours of clean energy, but based on some estimate of the carbon emission effectiveness of that megawatt hour. So in effect, you would measure at each time and location, so every hour at a specific location, what the marginal carbon emissions rate is for that location. And then you would, if you generate a megawatt hour of clean energy, you would get a certificate that's denominated in tons that represents the ton of carbon emission that your action helped to avoid. Now, this starts with a time and location specific measurement, but it meets our scalability and liquidity goals because it creates a ton denominated certificate that can be traded anywhere with anyone across the country. And so I like this idea. My only question is whether we can really get the momentum to stand this up, whether it be, the urgency objective, the administrative costs of standing it up. We also think that over time, these marginal differences in carbon emissions from location to location are going to shrink as coal resources retire, as more clean energy displaces more and more of the peakers. We're going to end up with a relatively efficient gas unit on the margin most of the time in most of the country. And so these differences will shrink over time. And so the value of this over a national rec will shrink. But this is, I think, a really interesting idea that's worth exploring and meets all of those objectives that I mentioned earlier for our clean energy markets. So with that, I will stop and thank you.
Thank you, Arne. Next, we have Kelli Joseph, the Senior Fellow in Electricity Market Design and Climate at the University of Pennsylvania, among other titles I know.
Hi, everybody. Let's see. So I'm going to take us in a little bit different direction, I think. I'm going to talk about what I think is needed in order to manage not just a lot of renewables on the system, but to actually get to a fully clean electric system. And I think about this in terms of what we need to have coordinated markets, and really what's underneath that is a lot of planning considerations. I'm going to talk through the reality of electricity policy, what actually is reliability, what I think are the challenges with markets for reliability, and then the challenges with relying on prices alone as we move through the energy transition. I think that there is a very important role for policy in this sector that goes beyond market fixing, and I'll get into that, and then talk about what I think are some of the planning and market design solutions that actually could help as we move through the transition and actually get us to where we want to be. So from my perspective, I think there's two challenges in the US for the energy transition. The first is that there's a huge lack of coordinated policy, not just federal and state, but across sectors, things like natural gas, water, electricity. And all of this is creating reliability risks. And you saw the NERC report that came out a couple of years ago highlighting this. And I think that in organized markets, the short-term price signal is great for managing dispatch, but I think there are limitations to relying on this alone to be the signal and to incentivize new entry. I have come up with what I think are three significant policy gaps in electricity policy in the US. The first, I said, there's no connection between those who set targets for decarbonization at either the state level or the federal level and those who have grid reliability responsibilities. I think this is an enormous policy gap. The second, I think the IRA has technology neutral incentives, but I think a very specific technical mix of resources is actually needed to enable reliable grid operations. And then finally, we just saw the EPA proposed carbon pollution standards. And in those, they actually require that there's some kind of meaningful community engagement as states put their compliance plans forward. And the EPA is recommending that states actually reach out to all reliability authorities, but there is no coordinated regional planning process for this kind of meaningful engagement with reliability authorities. And I think this is a huge concern, as I'll talk about, especially for ensuring that we have sufficient balancing resources and operating reserves as we move through the transition. To get to the punchline, before I get into the discussion, I think that scaling some of the technologies that can actually solve these challenges, that can provide the kinds of reliability services that we need on the grid, really need to make sure that we have these technology neutral incentives being focused and directed. And I'll talk about ways that I think we can do that. Not all of the technologies that can provide reliability services that can actually replace some of what natural gas will provide are possible in all geological locations. And I think that there's significant investment in additional infrastructure that's actually required to enable some of these technologies to scale. If we're looking at something like hydrogen, for example, we may need new pipelines. And then certainly for states that are wanting to keep coal and do any kind of sequestration, that's not necessarily possible. And that may also be a possible solution for gas plants as well. Okay, so I kind of talked about this already. I won't spend a ton of time here, but essentially the entities who are reliability coordinators are not the same entities who are actually setting policies. So whether you have an RTO or some kind of an imbalance market, these are not the entities that have anything to do with electricity policy. All the entities that are participating in those constructs, states who are having states who are having entities participate are setting these policies are not NERC-defined reliability coordinators. The markets that we're setting up are not the entities that can solve that challenge. And then again, NERC put out this report, highlighting some of what I talked about, not just the federal state, but the cross-industry challenges. So we talk a lot about grid reliability from the perspective of resource adequacy, but I like to talk about the fact that there's actually two components. So it's not just resource adequacy, but also operating reliability. And as we move through the transition, and we've already been talking about this, but the sources of uncertainty and risk start to change. And as the resource mix changes, the growing focus is really on operating reliability in the attempt to capture some of this in our resource adequacy modeling. And everybody, I think, knows this, but just when I'm talking about operating reliability, I'm talking about in real-time power system operations, the ability to meet mandatory and enforceable reliability standards, to manage the system to contingencies, to be able to respond to changes in grid frequency or voltage stability, to maintain supply-demand balance, and keep transmission lines within their rated limits. And when grid operators talk about this, they're talking about ancillary services. They're talking about this in terms of essential reliability services or grid attributes. And this is what I'm focusing on and what I'm talking about in this presentation here. And again, everybody knows this, but as we move through and the resource mix is changing, particularly as we're seeing a lot of renewable resources, meeting net load, ensuring that we have resources that can produce at all times. And what we really need are flexible, dispatchable resources that are quick start and fast ramping. And the sources of uncertainty are changing, and it's not just renewables that have variable output, but we have energy limited storage resources and fuel limited gas resources. And there's lots of uncertainty into where electrification targets are going, lots of changing and extreme weather, and then lots of customer sited generation, which today is really not visible to bulk grid operators. So here I want to talk very specifically about two kinds of ancillary services that I'm focused on when I'm thinking about what it takes to maintain operating reliability. I'm thinking about this in terms of balancing energy and operating reserves, and I'm keeping those separate, although they can provide, the entities that provide balancing energy could also provide operating reserves. But today, these resources are provided only pretty much by gas and batteries, increasingly by batteries, but both are limited, right? So storage resources are limited by how much they can actually discharge when they're fully charged. And gas resources are limited by whether they have sufficient gas production. There's challenges associated with trading gas, right, in real-time power system operations. And there's a concern that you actually have a gas system that's capable of supporting the needs of the electricity system throughout the transition. And I'll talk about that in more detail, but this is what I'm specifically talking about when I'm thinking about the way that grid operators are talking about the essential reliability services and grid attributes that they need. So let me take a step back and say, when we thought about setting up markets for reliability and we have challenges thinking about meeting resource adequacy, a lot of this stems from, economic theory. So when we set up the markets, the idea was that the LMP that provides the short-term market operation efficiency would also be the only signal that you need to ensure sufficient entry and exit. And in this paradigm, scarcity pricing is especially important. What was supposed to happen is that you'd have this symbiotic investment between generators and consumers. So consumers would want to hedge, right, this potential price risk that they would see. And the way that they would do that is by finding an LSE or a retail energy provider to manage that price risk for them. The way that they would do that is then enter into these long-term contracts with generators, and all was supposed to be fine. I'll talk in the next slide about why that didn't really happen. But underlying this is the idea that electricity is a commodity, and that markets for electricity are really just about delivery and hedging delivery risk and hedging price risk. That is the main signal. And we saw this recently in a report from Bill Hogan and Scott Harvey, who said it really doesn't matter which resource delivers energy, it only matters that energy is delivered. And I think as I talked about in the previous slides, the growing sources of uncertainty and risk and the types of resources that are actually providing balancing energy and operating reserves, I think points to the limitations of that assessment. So the reality, and I won't spend a ton of time on this, but when economists talk about what happened in these markets, they point to two specific reasons. So one, they point to things like missing money. So these are, we put price caps, we have concerns with market power, operators take actions, we have inelastic demand. I think that raises some serious equity concerns, which I can talk about. We have, non-convexity, and we have these reliability standards that are greater than what some kind of cost-benefit analysis would actually, the amount of resources that we would actually have. And then we started to talk recently about missing markets. So we have missing markets to manage risk. We have insufficient incentives for hedging, possibly for some of the reasons in the left column. There's always this default or bankruptcy option. So there's lots of reasons why the LMP alone and a scarcity pricing alone has never really been a sufficient investment signal to meet reliability targets. And I want to stress that I think that an LMP is helpful, it's useful, and it's important, and it's necessary for efficient short-term market operations. But I think that relying on that LMP to be the only signal for the types of resources that are needed to enable reliable system operations has always been a challenge. It's why we have capacity markets. It's why we have an ORDC, right? We've always had to have a fix in these markets. And going forward, I think there's lots of challenges with relying on prices alone, including that not all resources meet the requirements for operating reserves and balancing energy equally at all times. That's especially true as we see the types of resources that are coming as the resource mix is changing. I think that relying on price exposure as a hedging incentive for residential consumers creates some very serious equity concerns. We've always had to have these various market fixes, and relying on prices alone for balancing energy in an RTO, I think is going to be very, very challenging. Not to mention we have, coordination and policy challenges. I think that moving to decarbonize the electricity sector is a moonshot mission. And I take a lot of how I think about this from an economist named Mariana Mazzucato, who's been talking a lot about the idea that markets are always incomplete, they're always imperfect. And instead of the constant focus on fixing market gaps, creating new market products, we should instead ask, what is it that needs to be done? And I think that we need reliability-informed policy in markets that meet changing reliability needs throughout the transition. There's some serious implications, I think, of the policy gaps that I pointed out. They're creating reliability risks. It makes it very hard to plan across regulatory silos. It makes it very hard to invest in the kinds of technologies that may actually run less over time, but provide critical reliability services when they do. And it makes it hard to invest in the kinds of clean, dispatchable technologies that, as I said, may need additional infrastructure. When we talk about policy in the electricity sector, we often talk about it in terms of what's acceptable, right? So there's acceptable policy to correct for missing money. There's acceptable policy to correct for missing markets. So we're here in that framework, we're correcting for inefficiencies and trying to get back to relying solely on prices alone to manage the entry and exit of different resources. In that framework, when we talk about, having some kind of policy involvement, we often try to keep it away because we're worried about picking winners and we're worried about locking in inefficiency. But the reality is that policy plays a really critical role in technology innovation. Policy is important because it defines a direction, it can take on risk, it can ensure committed capital beyond research and development and actually into deployment. And it really does invest in what otherwise would not happen. So some of these clean, dispatchable resources that are really needed may not be able to, certainly are not be commercial today, probably unable to respond to some of the scarcity pricing signals for all the reasons that I've talked about in previous slides. And importantly, innovation is not something that happens only through the private sector. So there is a role for policy in the sector. And how I would like to have state policy think about this is along two timelines. So what do we need today? Today, we need resources that meet operating reliability needs in all hours, in all seasons, as more renewable resources come online. They need to provide very specific grid services. And today, that is pretty much only gas with sufficient fuel available and increasingly batteries. In the longer term, I think we need to think about targeted incentives for the kinds of resources that can actually replace fossil assets. So again, these would provide very specific grid services. And we know today a little bit about what kinds of technologies those could be. Things like geothermal, advanced nuclear, SMRs, hydrogen, bioenergy. We need longer duration storage. It's multi-day, perhaps multi-season. And then, for remaining fossil assets, something that can actually be abated. And to do that, I think that the technology neutral IRA incentives really need to be focused and directed. As I said, not all of these clean energy solutions provide the same kinds of reliability services. They're not all possible in all geological locations, and some require additional infrastructure to scale. I would like to see states act as the innovator of first resort in order to focus investment on these clean resources to provide the kinds of essential reliability service required for RTOs to be the supplier of balancing energy supplier of last resort as they are. They cannot do that if they do not have the kinds of resources that enable them to provide that critical role. I have a couple of ideas on how to manage this. So I have a planning and policy coordination solution that I think then informs what I think potentially some market design solutions could be. So what I would like to see is have states use the RTOs in a different way, really reimagine the role of the RTOs. So states would be giving the RTOs their plans. And these are our decarbonization targets. This is when we intend to reach them. They submit their various IRP plans. And as we move through EPA compliance, there are various state plans. And then the RTOs would give back to the states the information for both resource adequacy and operating reliability needs over defined timelines. And then that would help the states to understand the kinds of resources that are needed, help them to inform resource selection, and maybe even target IRA incentives. And then I actually have a pretty detailed assessment of what that looks like. So I would actually like that to be the reliability coordinator, and in some regions that is the ISO or the RTO, and have this done over very short timelines, 1 to 5 years, medium term 5 to 10 years, and over the longer term 10 to 20 years, but constantly assessing what are the targets that states are reaching, how does this help us enable grid reliability, specifically maintain operating reliability with balancing energy and operating reserves. And the RTOs are not the entities that pick any of these resources. This is not the role for an RTO. This is what states need to do. States need to understand the critical role that they play in shaping a decarbonized future. So to go back to, what will it actually take to replace gas? Probably everybody in this room knows this, but natural gas plays a huge role already today in electricity production, and it's increasingly expected to provide critical balancing energy. And the challenge in the United States is bringing on clean, flexible resources while ensuring that the natural gas system is actually capable of supporting the electric system needs throughout the transition. And recent NASB analysis recommended that this may actually require that we have some kind of strategic gas storage reserves, maybe even strategic pipelines. What would it actually take to replace those benefits that natural gas is providing today? I think it really takes focused policy. Markets alone cannot solve the gas electric coordination challenges. Markets alone cannot solve these decarbonization policy coordination challenges that create both reliability risk and investment risk. And markets alone cannot enable technology innovation, but we could have coordinated planning for the gas and electric sectors to make sure as we move through the transition that both sectors are capable of supporting each other and having policy that's actually focused on the kinds of technology that can replace the reliability services that it provides. The other concern is that there's very significant price volatility expected. We've kind of already talked about this already, that significant negative pricing, potentially then going up to very high scarcity pricing. This creates a lot of investment risk, huge investment risk for the kinds of resources that are expected to come in to replace, again, either provide natural gas today, keep those existing assets around, or actually transition to different kinds of resources that could replace those services. So much uncertainty in policy exacerbates this because there's uncertainty in what the resource mix even will be and how often these prices are expected to occur. That's not just in the real-time energy price, but I think that also happens in the ELCC construct. That is highly dependent on the resource mix, which is, again, highly dependent on a very uncertain policy. And ensuring that we have revenue sufficiency, not just for the assets today that are going to potentially provide less energy and you know, receive less revenue over time. But these new resources coming in that are all going to provide very critical reliability services when they do run. So there are some market design solutions that I think could help here. But the first step is recognizing that there is a critical role for planning. And I think these market designs that I'm going to quickly highlight actually do recognize the critical role of planning and then say, what are the kinds of markets that we could use around that critical need? Oh, and I should say, I think that bulk electric system reliability is a public good. I talked about RTOs as the supplier of last resort for these resources. And, you know, the task force to Congress actually identified this a long time ago, that what grid operators do to prevent network collapse is both non-exclusive and non-rivalrous, which is the definition of a public good. And that having a very specific mix throughout the transition is how we, I think, have a successful transition, recognizing that electricity is really key to reaching any of our decarbonization targets. So the first one, I think, there's a lot of talk about what are called hybrid market designs. I think there's a little bit of an odd definition of what these are, but I try to think about these as resources that are recognizing the critical role of policy as driving new entry. And they attempt to have designs that are informed by system planning. So really the idea is clearly separating the short-term market signal from the long-term investment signal and recognizing that there's value to the short-term dispatch, but that's not the signal that's going to provide the long-term investment signal. We don't talk about these enough, so that makes it hard, because what we actually need are auctions that can be designed to avoid lock-in and that can actually you know, replace as some of these non-commercial technologies become available. How do you avoid you know, keeping on those resources while bringing in some of the new ones? I think the other challenge is that most of these hybrid market designs still rely mostly on this financial incentive, right? Under the idea that electricity is a commodity and we just have to hedge price risk and delivery risk. So they really rely on an energy-only market construct to start with. I don't think we're ever going to see an energy-only market construct introduced anywhere else in the United States. So I think that's one of the challenges with the hybrid market designs. But there are some that actually do look at the need for very physical resources. But again, we're just not really talking about these. I do think the forward clean energy market potentially could be one. I have 2 slides left. The second is strategic reserves. So I think we ought to be thinking about this in the electricity sector, especially for natural gas resources. And everybody pays the cost of the resources that are needed for reliable grid operations. I think that if you are in an RTO, you have an obligation as a state to make sure that the RTO has the resources that they need. And then again, we could have competitive solicitation for the assets that provide strategic reserves. And a couple of examples would be you'd have battery assets that have a very dedicated set of resources to make sure that those assets are fully charged at all times whenever needed. You have gas with storage, dedicated storage, or firm transportation that cannot be curtailed. And there are ways to think about deploying these assets, for example, when we're in you know, an EA alert, for example. And then finally, we could just think about some kind of regional IRP and have competitive solicitation for the kinds of resources that are needed. You could potentially consider a hybrid option, since again, they clearly separate the short-term market signal from the long-term investment signal. And perhaps we just think about having some kind of regional IRP for strategic reserves alone. So that's my quick presentation, and I look forward to some discussion later. Thanks. Kelli.
All right, last but not least, we have Jessica Greenberg, Senior Manager of Growth Strategy and Power Markets at Enel North America.
I'm glad it's freezing in here so I could wear a sweater so I can attach this mic. Freezing. So excuse if my fingers don't work very well. Thank you, Robin, and thank you everyone for being here to listen to our conversation today. And I'm really excited to be part of this and to spark hopefully lots of, I want to say debate, conversation, good thinking. My job is, as Robin mentioned, growth strategy and power market analysis. So what does that mean? At Enel, I do business planning. I work in business development. I look at the next 5 to 10 years, figure out where we should develop, where are we going to site projects, what are the different factors that go into that, and then making sure that's all within the budget that we have on our team. So before I jump into my presentation, I like to start things with a little did you know facts. So did you know that the average Italian consumes 55 pounds of pasta per year? By itself, that might not mean anything to you, but compare it to your average American who consumes 15.5 pounds per year. 15 versus 55. That's a lot of pasta. So you might be wondering, why did I choose this random? Did you know? Most of my did you know facts are pretty random. Enel, the company I work for, is actually an Italian-based company. If you go to Italy, you can see little Enel-like things along the cobblestone. They are very dominant in Italy. Enel is the world's largest private operator of renewables and has been present in the United States for over 20 years. And we're the 4th largest wind and solar operator in the United States. We're a leading developer, owner, and operator, so not just a developer, we're an IPP of renewable energy plants. And with all of our offerings, we have many offerings, we're in 50 states and 2 Canadian provinces. The company operates around 70 utility scale clean power plants with a managed capacity of over 10 gigawatts powered by wind and solar energy, generating enough sustainable energy to meet the needs of over 1.6 million homes each year. That's my little plug for my company. So today I want to speak about what my considerations are for development strategy. So I'm going to give you guys a little view into how I do my job. And then what that means and what the implications are if, like, for when we go to 100% clean energy or as we transition into there. So as you can see, I'm going to talk about growth strategy considerations, remuneration options. I'm not going to assume everyone here understands energy markets, so I'll do a really quick energy prices 101 and what I think our challenges will be in 100% clean markets. And then I'm going to jump into price formation. I want to hone a little bit about price. And then last but not least, a little bit of wishful thinking, maybe some, bigger changes that could I could see helpful for, at least from an IPP perspective. So what are growth strategy considerations? There's a lot of them. I've tried to bucket them into 6 boxes here. I won't go into too much detail in all of them. But we don't decide to develop a project on just one of these boxes. We look at all of them all the time. We do cost benefit analysis. We do a risk assessment. But we're looking at policy support. Are there RPS targets, tax incentives, any other voluntary targets? We look at load growth. So I was just in the session on data centers and the big and manufacturing centers and the big load growth that we're seeing forecasted. So it's really, really great for IPPs. I mean, people are going to need energy. So that's important. Resource. Is it windy? I mean, is it sunny? We're not going to put necessarily a solar plant where there's just rain most of the year. Some developmental considerations. So is permitting challenging? Is there land availability? NIMBYism? What we really hear about a lot, at least I've been at a couple ESIG conferences, we talk a lot about transmission. So we want to be siting near transmission lines. Congestion is such an important topic. It can make or break the financial viability of a project for us. So we want to be able to make sure that we're making money. So if we're producing electricity at our node, but we can't get it to the hub where we're going to sell it, or we're going to lose too much money by doing so, it's not really going to be viable. So congestion's a really, really hot topic in all of my meetings right now. Interconnection costs, it's getting more and more expensive to stay in the queue and provide, the queues are taking years and years and years, and with that, it's getting more and more expensive. We look at regional transmission plans. It's really important to know where transmission is being planned. The sooner we know, the better. We'll try to site near those transmission lines. And I don't want to forget GETS deployment. It's also a really great option, and hopefully we're going to see more use of GETS. Finally, I'm going to talk about markets. I left this one to last because it's going to transition to my next slides. Looking at different revenue sources, are there capacity markets, ancillary service markets, rec markets, energy market? Most ISOs, RTOs have energy markets, or are we looking at areas like WEC where it's not it's not a market, it's not an organized market. So we're looking at a variety of different things. Is the market a large market? Do we want to be there? Like PJM is the biggest market in North America. It's huge. Like, why wouldn't we want to be there? So there's going to be challenges with every one of these boxes. There's always an issue. We're not going to ever get everything, but we do need to figure out how to piece all of these boxes together to make a viable project, something that people are going to want to invest in, that we're going to get some equity partners involved, and that the company is going to support because it is financially viable. So we at the end of the day, as much as we all want to help the environment, we're still a business. And so price is still very, very important to us. So from a market perspective, this is where we recover our fixed costs. So we have $0 short and marginal costs. Through the market revenues is where we are intended to recover our fixed costs. So what are those options? Market revenues, we see energy market, LMPs, capacity market, RECs, ancillary services. We've heard all of these terms already today. Then there's other revenue opportunities, power purchase agreements, and tax credits, which are a huge driver for investment today. So this is my little energy prices 101. I'm going to walk you through this pretty quickly. This is a market supply curve for New York ISO. I took it off of the FERC site or FERC report. I don't have a clicker, so I'm just going to hopefully describe this. On the left, on the bottom x-axis, we have the amount of megawatts. So like, if you think about it as demand, oh, does it work? Oh, good. This might be harder. I'm not going to do that. It's going to be too hard of an angle. It's just going to get complicated. So, and on the y-axis, we have price. And so you can see with the green, the blue, the yellow resources on the bottom left corner, those are our clean energy sources, or at least how I think of clean energy sources, those $0 short and marginal cost resources, water, wind, nuclear. As you get into the orange, you get gas, and so New York is very gas heavy, and you can see the increasing, these are offer prices, and the vertical lines are different demand targets for New York. It's pretty small on my screen, so hopefully it blew up pretty big over here, but the first vertical line is the minimum load, and each line represents a different load target for the New York ISO. So you can see even at a minimum load right now, gas is setting the price. As we move towards more clean energy, the green, and I'm assuming there'll be some solar in here, the curve starts shifting to the right. So that $0 marginal cost gets longer, the horizontal line gets longer, and the hockey stick part of it kind of moves over to the side, and demand is now, price is being set by those clean resources. So while today we may see, it looks about like $35 to $40 prices most of the time in New York, as we move towards and transition, those prices are going to be suppressed and going closer and closer to $0. So in many of today's markets, and certainly in a future market, generation and storage owners must collect most of their revenues during periods of supply shortages. So this is when we've talked about scarcity pricing. This is when the prices are typically set by administratively determined scarcity prices rather than by the most expensive generator needed to serve the marginal megawatt of load. And we need this to recover our investment costs. However, these energy prices are capped, and scarcity pricing doesn't occur every day, every hour. And so we're not so certain that these revenues are going to be enough to recover our costs. I can't cross my fingers and hope for a winter storm. So what are our challenges in 100% clean markets? I've thrown 4 boxes up here. There's going to be a lot of challenges. Transmission availability, interconnection queues, siting, they're all issues today. Will they go away? Maybe, hopefully, probably not. But for me, remuneration is really important. I need to get paid. We need our money. We need to recover our fixed costs, make sure that we recover those investment costs, and that's usually done over the course of the lifetime of the plant. So why is price formation important? So I just have, it's a arbitrary graph here. It's using a Hitachi forecast. It's using the MISO Missouri monthly LMP, and we've got some rec prices and some capacity prices in there. So you can see from this, what I would like you to take away is how big that energy revenue is for us. It's huge. And if prices start going closer and closer to zero, that gray area gets smaller and smaller. So our revenues, our energy revenues get smaller and smaller. And even in the Hitachi forecast that was just recently released, those capacity and rec prices aren't meant to really make up more of a portion of our revenue stack. And so it's still not, maybe it'll go up. I don't know if it's going to be enough to compensate for all this missing gray area as we go towards $0 resources. So as the cost of producing electricity approaches zero and more renewables on the system, storage, batteries, some hydro storage probably will be the only resources with some short and marginal costs, which is why the title of this presentation wasn't fully accurate. But in fact, these resources may shift to offering at a higher opportunity cost. I think in the academic world, that's the hope, is that these batteries will offer opportunity costs rather than their short run costs. And this could provide some additional energy revenues for non-storage clean resources. But as I mentioned, I don't know if it's going to be enough. This gray area is a big area. So have some ideas, as we all did. Price adders. I mean, they exist today. There's price adders everywhere. Capacity markets, the missing money. And so just 4 little buckets here that I just wanted to flag. Some of these exist in markets today, some don't, not all have them. It's really, no market has to have everything. They get to pick, and every RTO ISO gets to pick and choose. So there's scarcity pricing, there's capacity markets, value of flexibility. I know we've talked about maybe putting more value on a flexibility product, and then the value of carbon displacement. Carbon curve, we've also talked about that today, so I won't go into too much detail there. So to sum it up, this is my last slide, so hopefully we have enough time for questions after. Given it takes time to change markets, I want to ensure that there's thoughtful discussion around price formation so we are prepared for the future. There are a lot of uncertainties. However, I think that there's little doubt that energy price as it's defined today will be sufficient to cover our fixed costs and incent investment. Something will need to change to ensure that we can recover those investment costs. While it would be great to see an increase in other forms of revenue, it is difficult to say whether it could cover the cost of lost energy revenues. If the energy price is truly intended to help recover fixed costs in the long run, a more holistic view of price formation needs to be taken, which may result in a more complicated outcome. What could change? Here's my wishful thinking. Maybe we can change the way we offer energy. Maybe we move away from short and marginal costs. It might mean a shift into an open competitive market where generators can offer a price that can cover their fixed costs. Maybe price starts including our fixed costs. Then we just let natural market competition ensure that price is as low as possible. There's enough different generators out there. Alternately, maybe we move to a world where the PPAs and contracts cover all the fixed costs and those contract prices go up. I don't know how many people I'm angering here, but we might want to revisit the concept of floor prices. I know it's been discussed before, and I'm not saying our floor price should be $30, but a non-zero dollar floor price for offers so that at least there's dollars coming in. Just throwing some things out there. So we do need to consider options for the future so we're ready. Consumers and the environment will benefit if there's competitive and more efficient mechanism that complements reliability as we shift towards a cleaner grid. In other words, price formation is what can tie reliability to affordability and result in efficient market outcomes. And ultimately, hopefully, it will drive investment. Thanks.